Someone called and asked about Laman Street, and Laman Street's a really interesting um, story that I guess is was fairly politicised. So, for example, and those of you who don't know the story, there were 14 Ficus microcarpa outside the Art Gallery and Library in Laman Street, Newcastle. And during the Pasha Bulka storm, and we'll say there's two different views. One was that the trees fell over with their root plates tilted out of the ground. Another one was the trees partially failed. But there was some evidence that the trees may have moved in the ground, at least in any case. And someone did an assessment, and there was this arguing backwards and forwards about it that resulted in a small little expenditure of $1.98 million before the tree removal started. So it was a rather unfortunate incident in terms of public spending and conflicts, but it does raise some of the issues that are normal parts of report writing, and I thought we'd cover those, and I'd sort of show you some of the images and bits and pieces, and you can figure out where things went right and where things went wrong. So who was the person that asked about?
It was me, Mark. Andrew.
Yeah, okay. So Andrew, have you actually read the document that I wrote?
Yeah, I read the whole website.
Oh, the whole website.
Save Our Fix, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, Save Our Fix is one side.
Yeah, I saw your report on there, and there was a couple of the other reports as well.
And it's always like these things. It's difficult. One of the things that I did come away from it all learning was that never ascribe anything to malice or intent or sneakiness that could be adequately accounted for with stupidity. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, but somewhat respectfully. During the Pasha Bulka storm, none of the trees fell over with the root plates tilted out of the ground. And that was one of the statements that was made to justify the removal of the trees. Root plates have failed. Later, it came out that what had happened is there was the Chinese whispers game. Somebody had communicated to an arborist that the trees had failed. And by failed, they meant had moved slightly in the ground or had moved the surrounding surfaces. And I'll see if I can quickly pull up for you guys a few images, so it'll help you have a context for it all. So yes, I'm not sure who, and like all these things afterwards, it's very hard to dissect and find out what actually did go on. Come on. It's not going to let me search, which is unfortunate. Should, but tells me I need to do a restart. That's what you want to do at this stage. Let me see if I can do this another way for you. I might have to do a restart, and I'm really trying to avoid doing that for losing time. So what had happened, I'll describe it to you, is that two of the fig trees appear that they have developed a gap between the adjacent curb and gutter and the trees. Now, that's in a storm that was technically a 1 in 200 storm in terms of inundation and wind at the same time. So that coincides with those two things. And so the thought was that the trees may have failed, and that was communicated to an arborist in Melbourne, and that arborist wrote a report. That report said, look, these trees are dangerous, and they currently pose a risk of about 1 in 15 of killing somebody. Now, 1 in 15 is a pretty high risk. That's like imminent. And there's 14 trees. So 1 in 19, 1 in 19.8 it was. So 1 in 20, if we say around there. 14 trees means that about every 18 months we should have someone dead. The debacle went on for 3 or 4 years, and finally ended up in court. And my report, Andrew, and a fair criticism of my report would be that it's emotive, and that I think it was described by Mike Ellison as it was like I'd rolled up the Sydney Morning Herald and taped it up and started beating the other parties with it. And it wasn't intended to be that way, but it was that way. Now, there are some other criticisms of it. My spelling and grammar, I'm always battling with spelling and grammar. Even when we had a commercial editor edit things, there was still a typo here and there. And to be fair, that was the case in every report. So that didn't change, not just mine, but any report. One of the criticisms when I finally published a paper with Douglas O'Callaghan and Mark Stewart was that the editorial committee wrote back and said, after some criticisms of it, you didn't give credit to the photographer of this image. And we responded that's because the original author didn't give credit. We didn't know whose image it was. So yes, the situation with Laman Street was lots of conspiracy theory, I guess, from my side. Like it looks like they're trying to fabricate the stuff. In reality, it was just stupid mistakes. So the arborist in Melbourne hadn't seen the trees. He hears the trees have failed during the storm, and he assumes that that's the trees failed. The second arborist who reviews the situation then goes off that description. The trees have failed with the root plates tilted out of the ground. And so he repeats that instead of going out and independently going through that process. On the other hand, I went from the alternate. I had photographs, no trees with the root plates tilted out of the ground, where the trees are still existent. You could see that they hadn't failed. And you could see they hadn't failed because the bitumen and the soil around them was all nice and consolidated still. If they'd tilted and then come back down, that wouldn't have come back down perfectly into the ground and everything being consolidated around. So my thought was, well, hang on a second, someone's trying to pull the wool over someone's eyes, whereas it was just a simple series of mistakes. Some of the interesting things that did come out of Laman Street, in the end, there was criticism of the paper that Mark and Dogger and I had written. And so we asked for a copy of that. One of the criticisms was that we stated that the trees were removed because of risk. And somebody from the council said that was completely wrong. We've done the wrong thing. We've misrepresented them. It was the trees were removed for reasons other than risk. And I can share that was a major game changer. A number of people changed positions and got fired over that because they'd gone off to court and had given evidence in court saying that the trees were being removed because of risk.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So why they were removed, I think risk was an element. I certainly think there was a sense of fear because the message had been communicated that these 14 trees were the most dangerous trees in the entire city, and they were all one beside each other. And so it was a little unusual to get that situation. Unfortunately, there are other mistakes that were made. One of them was one of the arborists said, look, these trees are so close to failing that they're going to fail. They're at a safety rating of 1. And if we're going to make them safe, we need to get that back to 4 to 1. So the way to do that is to halve the load all the way over the tree. So we just cut the length of every branch and the whole tree in half, we'll get to 1/4 of the load. Of course, that was erroneous. You only need to make small amounts of reduction to get huge amounts of margin. And if you're with tips last week and you saw the tree count, you'll see how, again, just a small reduction in height can have a huge increase in safety margins. So the trees could have probably been reduced and retained. But I suspect there are other reasons why that happened. I know that Classmatic brought into the discussion a number of people. It was really quite an international thing. The suggestion was looking at doing some static testing. Dynamic testing wasn't available at that stage, or was in its infancy at that stage. So looked at static testing. Matic says no, and here are some reasons why. And what was really odd is that report was commissioned by an electrical authority and not by the council. And, you sort of sit there and think, well, why were they buying into it? No, part of the reason was, the trees had failed. It would have affected their cables. But on the other hand, if the trees had failed and it would have affected their cables, you've got to ask the question, well, then why did someone think the trees had failed in the first place? So the language changed. And one of the things that's changed permanently in arboriculture in Australia, and to a lesser extent, but it's starting to worldwide, is this describing things as either complete failures or partial failures or serviceability failures. So let's define those. Complete failure, catastrophic failure, the bit drops off. A partial failure, codominant stem splits, hits a notch or a fork, union, and then stops. It doesn't go any further. It might stay like that for 50 years. Serviceability failure is when a footpath gets a crack. It's still a serviceable footpath, but it's not what it was originally. So in the case of these trees, they may have listed half a degree. Well, half a degree list is not the end of a tree, and particularly if it doesn't go further. Now, in that regard, I think there were 4 trees that were of concern during Laman Street, during the Pasha Bulk storm. One failed, another one looked like it shifted, and a couple more. One of the ones that looked like they shifted, they did a really sensible thing. They surveyed it, and they monitored it using a surveyor's marks on the tree. So they put in pins and put in measurement points on an adjacent building and triangulated off that. And they found that the tree wasn't moving, so they retained that tree. And I think that's an interesting tell of the whole situation again, that there seemed to be this secondary agenda. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I would give as a message to anyone who is writing a report is to be very frank about those secondary agendas. So, if your client wants to get a granny flat in, and that's a part of the rationale behind the report they're requesting, then communicate that. Take away the uncertainty and the appearances of questionability in that process. And I think that's something that is hard for us to do often, but it's in other ways it's really quite simple. Consideration is being given to the installation of a granny flat. At least that way the parties are aware of what's going on. And I think that in this situation, had the local council said, look, regardless of the level of risk, we still want to do this because A, B, C, X, Y, Z, it'd have been the end of the argument. It'd have been $1.5 million saved, because you can't argue about people's choices. The other thing I'd say that has come out of it is, and I'd advise all the time, try not to remove everything at once. If you're going to remove an area, if you're going to go through a renewal area, if you can stage it, every second tree, every third tree, a portion, a small area rather than a big area, which may not always be appropriate. The second thing I'd say is, where you can, replant before you remove. I don't think they could have done that at Laman Street, but there's certainly this is not the first one, and Save Our Figs has got a number of other areas where similar sorts of things have happened, and there's certainly one site, and I'll share that with you. I can share that. Let's have a look. New window. Let me see. Share screen. I'm pretty sure I've been given privileges. Yes, I have. Okay, you should see replication of it and a new Google screen. And we go to, let's say Newtown's probably my closest. Yeah, I guess part of the issues at the time was also historically, some of you will recall that we had a number of figs fail around that sort of time. And that was really the beginning of fig tree failure was the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. We've started to see trees that had always been considered by us indestructible, with big limbs, codominant stems fail, complete failures. And so there was a change in how we saw figs to some extent. And that started to have some influence in the way that people within the community reacted and the way that we reacted. So let me find Newtown. Very good at this, I'm sorry, guys. Angel.
Where that major road forks, Mark.
Yeah, I've found where I've got to go, Lillian Fowler Reserve. So this was one that occurred about 2004, 2005, something like that. Is this tree here? And we're in a wonderful situation. We can go back in time with our system. So see more dates, and we can go back to 2007, and you can see the tree's been lopped. Yeah.
Yep.
And what had happened in this one, really quite amazing in many ways. Codominant stem in here, failed, came across, took down these power lines, broke a pole, took a piece of gutter out. And again, that same concept of maths, and I'll go back up the street a bit so you can see it a little bit better. The same concept in maths had come out, and that was the only way you can reduce the risk associated with this sort of thing is to cut it back really hard. And so that's what they did. They cut, essentially the length in half of everything that was over the road, over towards a building, and said that was it. Now, there were some interesting things in this one. One of them was I suggested that they could probably put in devices to create aerial roots in ficus. Let me just get you a spot where it's stable and I can get a good shot of it. It just does not want to behave. I don't want that sign in the way. Come on. That's better. Certainly that's not what I would have called reduction pruning, and I can say this reduction pruning was supervised by a TAFE teacher of high standing who said that's the way you do reduction pruning. Not how I felt about it. There's another one down here. We'll have a look at it in a minute, and you'll be able to see that as well. But what the local community did was they said, look, we're prepared to accept some risk. We understand there's some risk with the trees, but for the benefits, we're prepared to do things. So you can see here, they've bagged up some peat and stuff around an aerial root, and they're going to try and get some aerial roots growing. And here you can see the aerial roots have hit the ground now. So this is ground level. This is prop level. So this is now giving support. That stem that's over the building has now developed a whole prop that would prevent this stem ever failing at the spot. If we look at it 2020, you can see that's now quite substantial. So that was one of the suggestions that we gave it. Why they haven't done it in other areas and taken advantage of that, I don't know, but it's something that I would encourage. If you've got a question about a fig, encouraging aerial roots to grow has its advantages where you've got a questionable structure. But the bottom line of that, as you see, that was about 2005. Here we are, 18 years later, we've got a tree that's still there. It's a great outcome in my mind. It is in a playground that's used by students during school time. So that's another part of the issue. And I will go back to this tree, and I'll try and get you some still shots as well. But this tree was also raised in question. There's a cavity on the other side, and that's how I got called in. I got called in. There was a cavity. Somebody came out and did a tomograph, and the tomograph test said there's almost no cavity in there. And the person doing the tomograph test said, "But Mark, I can see the cavity. I can put my hand in, I can fit my head into the cavity, and the tomograph's not showing it." And he said, "Can you go out and look and see what the issue might be?" And I got out there and I said, "Yes, it's beautifully compartmentalized at about 2 meters off ground, and the waves are going over the cavity rather than trying to go around. So it's actually a shorter path." And that's why they were getting a false reading. So they were getting a false negative because the cavity come to an end. This tree was also pruned. At this point of time, the TAFE teacher said, "I'm going home to the tree crew. You know what to do. You guys do it." And on this side, this rubiginosa, there was no way you could tell it had been pruned unless you had a really careful look. It was just beautifully done reduction pruning. And again, they probably only took 10% of the load out, but that's a huge difference. And the great thing about a small amount of reduction pruning like that is it allows the tree to otherwise grow and strengthen itself as it will put on new layers of tissue. Of course, one of the things that we discussed last TIPS was hollow trees. Who was there at TIPS last time round?
Last week or?
Yeah, last week.
Yeah, I was here. Yeah.
Yeah, remember we looked at a strangler figs, and when you get a strangler fig created, and the whole inside goes. Is how the wood is distributed on the outside. If you haven't read Frank Rin's more recent work on the application of wall thickness, you probably should have a hunt down of it, or ask Peter for a copy and he can make it available. But TR is really not a good, reliable thing for older trees. And, this by no means has this rubiginosa reached its full size, but it's reached a fair proportion of its total height. And so TR starts to change rapidly once your vertical height starts to change, once the vertical growth starts to slow. The tree is getting stronger, but the load isn't increasing proportionately. So you start to get a tree that gets progressively stronger and stronger. And I think I showed you last time around several trees that had cavities that were in excess of 95%. One of them had my son and daughter, my youngest son and his daughter in there, and I wasn't trying to kill them. I really do like them. Well, yeah, as much as I like anybody. In terms of, it was just showing that, these trees are amazing things. They're incredibly solid. So that was at, what was the name of that suburb? Alexandria. No, is it Alexandria? Lillian Fowler. See what does Lillian Fowler reserve for me. No, I thought I might have had some Lillian Fowler shots. Oh yes, there we are. So that's the that one support root coming down. So it's certainly been a successful part of that project, and that was took about 4 or 5 years on a branch that had been, or a stem that had been lopped. So had it not been lopped, that growth rate would have probably been 3 to 4 times faster.
Could that option have been used in Newcastle with those figs, or was it?
Probably a little harder, but certainly the ones on the park side, the answer is yes, probably fairly readily. But a good reduction pruning would have been suitable in hindsight. And again, it's really easy to say that now, given that we've gone through that process. This is the stem of that other rubiginosa, and that's a reasonable sized rubiginosa. There's a fungus growing on the inside of that cavity. You can see the roof of the cavity there. And that fungus is actually an oyster mushroom. So it's growing down inside the tree. So it's a pretty unique little situation. Now, if I can, I'll just see if I can do one more in Newtown, and it may give it to me. No, not going to spend any more time. So yes, that's the basic Laman Street story. Now, what do you learn out of that? Well, first of all, avoid negative comments, avoid harsh words. And one of the things that was really neat was when Laman Street, and I should be able to pull that up. Just can't believe that I can't find it. Laman Street, there we are. I thought I'd start the folder somewhere. So I'll pull a couple of these up and you can have a look at a couple of the images. So mine's this one. And I'll just go quickly through it. I bet you if I look for a phrase, and this would be a phrase that I like to use if I was discussing things, Control F for find. Come on. Oh, it's password encrypted. Don't tell me that. If you go through there, you'll find a phrase like in fact. What does in fact say? Obviously. What does obviously say?
Is your opinion, mate? You're saying it should be a certain way.
Yeah, well, in fact, says that everything else was wrong. When my children say to me, but
it's a bit sharp. It's critical of the whatever you're talking about, the other opinion.
That's right. So you've got to be careful of how you word things, is what I'm saying. Gently, gently, catchy monkey is the old saying. So you can say, when I say obviously, I'm saying, well, they obviously didn't pick it up, which means they weren't that bright. They're not very clearly, all little words like that. You've just got to be careful how you use them in the communication process.
My editor inserts the words "in my opinion" occasionally.
In my opinions are great. And when we're talking about expert evidence, in my opinion is a good starting point. And that's the next bit, is how do we deal with, in my opinion? The answer is we've got to explain what that means. In my opinion is based on my experience. Is it my opinion based on what I've read? Is it my opinion based on empirical observation that is substantiated statistically? What does in my opinion really mean? Let's be honest, lots of people out there have opinions that are completely farcical, us included. So we've got to be careful that we don't go into that thing. Secondly, given the fact that these trees had not been blown over, so I'm pretty harsh on that. And I say that they haven't been blown over because they hadn't. And that was just a choice of words where the author said that they've blown over with the root plates tilted out of the ground. Marsden concludes that the trees would need to be reduced to the point that no or very little leverage was extended to the root plate. This, of course, is illogical at its best, far too harsh. While I accept that that's his opinion, mathematically and by applying rules of physics, there may be some other options. And that's a lot softer way of saying that sort of comment. And I approached it somewhat factually, but factually based on what I'd assumed. And one of the things I assumed was there something else happening for some reason. They wanted to do something else, which turned out to be correct in the end, but it didn't make sense that that wasn't coming out, and it just kept on going back to risk issues. So that's the problem with that as a report. Yes, it doesn't follow the standard technical system of starting up with a brief and an assumptions and then a method. And by the way, it is a method. And if I see methodology too many more times, I'm going to scream. But because we're not usually comparing methods. When we compare methods, it's a methodology. It's a process of looking at the methods. That's what ology means, study of methods.
I've given up worrying about that, Mark, because it's used so commonly that it seems to be taken to mean method.
Well, it's interesting where the Standards Australia Committee for the Review of AS 4373's meeting, and the question came up about language and the word fence. Is it fence or is it fencing? And fencing is a verb in almost every other country except Australia. In Australia, it's also used as a noun because we've got so used to describing, there's fencing along the road rather than there are fences along the road. So methodology, you're right, Peter, is just becoming so much a part, at least of the Australian vernacular, that we actually mean it to be method, even though we use methodology. And let's be honest, I'm sarcastic about these things, but methodology makes us sound like we're more intelligent. So it's a bigger word. And when you use big words, they tend to make you sound very photosynthesis. Okay. In other words, no point using a big word and misusing it, but we all do it. And hopefully if you're typing a word in a report and you have any inkling that, is that the right word? You should be looking it up in a dictionary and double checking to make sure that you haven't misused it. So that's my report. That would be the criticisms of it. It's really reviewing the reports and being quite hard in the way that it handled that. So that's probably not a good way to deal with a matter like that. Now I'll go to the next one. Mark's other activities, Laman Street. Now that's a report that was written after. This is a scientific paper that was prepared, looking at how these things work in terms of communities and how risk is communicated. So lots of good things came out of Laman Street, not just bad things. And to show you again, this is David Lonsdale's report. David Lonsdale bought into the process and, done a very good formal job. He's sat down and talked about what he's doing. He's talked about the documents that he's reviewed. And he talks about the issues in a very nice and systematic way. And David's conclusion was, let me come down to it. Although I've seen evidence that assessments of hazard and risk for these trees have been conducted carefully and, in most respects, according to appropriate principles, I think certain aspects of the assessments deserve reconsideration. These include the following: assessment of the probability of failure of various trees, assessments of occupancy of the target areas, the severity of pruning that might be required to reduce the lever arm of the trees enough to improve the safety to a more acceptable level.
That's more or less saying better go back to square one and start again, isn't it?
But isn't that so much more gentle, Peter, than the way I did it?
Yes.
And so remember not to get in there and get personal. And even if you're not being personal, ask yourself, how's the other party going to respond? Now, Peter, can we talk candidly, Peter?
Sure.
We've never had this discussion. I got called into a site at Alstonville to do an assessment of a site that Peter had been out to. And by then I'd screwed up with Laman. I'd made a few more mistakes. And hopefully, Peter, when I wrote that report, did you feel like I was beating you up?
I never actually got to see your report, Mark.
No, really.
Yeah, no, I've never seen it. I was promised it a number of times, but I've never yet seen it.
If you email me, Peter, I will send it to you.
Okay.
It was very careful not to do it. Having said that, my natural style is not to be aware of other people's emotions, not to be aware of how those things. So I just call it as I see it. And so I've got to be really careful to work it out. The other thing that I do when I write, and I think I've mentioned this before, is I write long paragraphs and long sentences. And I now work hard to keep them shorter. I notice here, David's already got one that's 1, 2, 3, 3.5 lines long. That's a long sentence. Out of habit now, I try and shorten that. Not that I always do, but I try to. Because the shorter a sentence is, the easier it communicates the central point of that sentence. The longer it is, the more likely it is to be lost. And the more you join or do run-on sentences, the more complex the thinking process behind it and the harder it is for the reader to understand. So try and keep them as simple and as short as possible. So that's Laman Street. Andrew, does that give you some background?
Yeah, that was really good. Thank you.
Shocking report is the bottom line, but still a report nonetheless.
When I first read it, I thought it was a bit emotive. Yeah.
Yeah, look, in reality, from my side, it wasn't, but I can see how that comes across as emotive. In other words, when I say, in fact, I'm just simply saying it is a fact that, and the trees hadn't failed. There's photographic evidence of the stumps, trees cut down with the bitumen around, and I will try and find them.
The trees were eventually all removed, weren't they?
Yes, all 14 were removed, and they were replanted with new ficus.
That's right.
And to give some other context for this, and I've got to be careful again because I don't want to tread on toes, but it wasn't that long ago, 2011, the International Society of Arboriculture is here in Australia, in Parramatta, as they would say it, Parramatta, and Sydney City Council announced to the world every fig tree in Hyde Park was getting cut down. It was the only option. 3 experts had written reports. It was, the only way forward. Here we are, 2023. The trees are there. There's no plans to remove them. What happened? What changed? So there's a degree of which you start to get some skepticism, and also where you get some learning. Since then, trees have failed. In particular, one tree that I was involved with the planting of failed. It was only a 30-year-old tree. The trees that they're most concerned about don't. And that's what I tell you all the time when it comes to risk assessments, is that often the things that we worry about don't eventuate. The things when tree risk assessment, and the things we don't worry about are the things that sort of blindside us. So, yeah, in that situation, what was the view of authors, and some of those authors of those expert reports have done a 180-degree backflip. I don't know how you do that. I don't get that, unless you sit there and you say, I was of the opinion that this was the case. However, since then, I've got this. You've got to have some way of explaining it. And I think I mentioned either last war or last tips about a tree in Castle Hill falling apart. And I said to you, I can't consider it a high-risk tree. I can't consider the risk unacceptable. So even though I think the tree should go, it's not going to go on the basis of risk. It's up to the consent authority to make decisions about that, not for me.
Yep.
And you've got to be aware that everything you write stays there for a long period of time. You can go find reports that I wrote 20 years ago and see how bad my spelling and grammar was back then. And you'll say, hey, Mark is making some improvements, slow as it is. He's a little bit retarded, but that's okay. We'll forgive him. So when you make a comment you've got to be careful that, you're not in a situation where you seem to be backflipping. And one of the reasons you don't want to do that as an expert is because at some stage you're either going to be called to task about it.
Yeah.
And that starts to become difficult.
If you've changed your mind and for whatever reason you now have a different opinion, then surely it's better to be frank about that.
Absolutely, Peter.
I mean,
what's really important is not that you change your mind, but you know why you changed your mind and you can articulate that.
I think it's part of, normal professional development to keep studying and keep finding out new things, and you do your best that you can at the time, but hopefully that improves over time.
Absolutely. I just went through a template today for a transplant project, and I talked about after completing mulching the tree with age mulch. And I thought, I wonder how long that's been in there. It really should be with green mulch, seed-free green mulch, because that's going to get me my best benefits. And I know that we've been mulching with green mulch for 12 or 15 years. So, but yes, why? Because it seemed like the smart thing was to avoid nitrogen drawdown, but research has repeatedly shown since the mid-1990s that green mulch is not a problem for the plant material, just for soil chemistry. That's only transient. And so being able to articulate that helps my reader understand, and also means that if someone called me on it, Peter, and said, hey, you said, I can deal with that. I just don't know how, as an expert, you deal with, there is no other option but to remove these trees, all 130 something or other, and then to come back 2 years later and say, these trees can be retained with appropriate management. That's a hard flip. And the one issue that happens with that, and it's the nice thing about being old and having stuff where I've made mistakes 20 and 30 years ago, is that under examination, somebody could say to me, well, but you used to say use aged compost or aged mulch. I can say that I've learned and that I've come along. But if you do complete backflips in a matter of a short period of time, one of the things they could say was, so what, was you weren't very competent back then, or you're not competent now? Not that you or I would say that, but that's what a good barrister would at least start to allude to, which goes to the whole process of writing a legal report. And a legal report, and we've talked about this before, but there was a scathing decision in the court, in the district court here about 3-4 months ago, and involved a fairly well-known consulting arborist to some of you, a guy called Hartley. And the district court judge said, Mr. Hartley gives lots of opinions, but doesn't account for how he has them, and essentially dismissed the report. Okay, what the judge was saying is, you haven't told me what assumptions you're making. So what assumptions are you making? So the Laman Street, the trees had failed with the root plates tilted out of the ground. The assumption that I made is that meant that the root plates had elevated up and there were broken roots and the soil had been fractured around the tree. That would be the assumptions I was making when I read that phrase. Now, by saying that, we've added clarity to the situation. That's what the assumption I'm making. The next thing that I would say is the photograph doesn't show this. And in my experience, when a tree has the root system come out of the ground, it never settles back into level. I've seen probably in my lifetime 2,000 or 3,000 tree failures and never seen one settle back down and a week later have no appearance that it has actually failed out of the ground. That would be the rationale behind and the supporting evidence behind what I've done. And that's important, but at least then a person can look at the position. My opinion is the trees hadn't failed as described. And this is why I say that. And I've also explained the assumptions that got me to say that. That is, I have assumed that that author meant something. And that author, in fact, there we are, there's the in fact did mean something, because he showed photographs of other trees out of the ground. He had himself, when he heard about root failure, he had himself assumed that that is what it meant. So two of the authors, the author out of Melbourne and then the author that did the review, which is Dennis Marsden, but both assumed that what was being described to them was trees that were fallen over, not trees that had bumped the adjacent curb a centimetre away from them. Okay, so it's why it's important to state your assumptions. It's very important to make clear. And there's actually a fairly important case that does it. It's Makita v. Sproul. And in Makita v. Sproul, these obligations given, you know, just because you're an expert doesn't mean that your opinion is sacrosanct. You need to go through the process of letting the court understand what assumptions you've made to get that opinion, and then what you're basing that on, what evidence and what expert evidence. So those are things that you need to add into an expert's report. And that would ideally be in every report. You know, every report we'd write would be perfectly written, and we'd get given, who is commercial, Mona, you're local government. Who is local government on? Derek sort of crosses both sides a bit. You know, it's not very often you get a client that says, look, need to write a good report, and yeah, look, take 20 or 30 hours and just take your time, bill me out as much as you need to, and we'll be happy. I have very few clients that ever say that to me. Most of them are concerned about the time constraints and the cost. And so there's balance that up in the process. What I will say is, if it's for the court, then you need to do that process of going through the three things. And I would say for every key fact that you want to present, you need to be giving those things, what assumptions you've made and what evidence you're relying upon, what's your opinion about it. And they need not just to be there, because in this particular report, they were there probably not as clearly as they should, but they need to be blatantly obvious so that anyone can find them. And a part of the issue with that particular case, I suspect, was that one solicitor was certainly out lawyered by the other solicitor. And if it's not simple, people will find it hard to follow through. So when you're writing your report, think about that. The question was, have these trees fallen? Then you'd go through that process, I'd say, and answer that question in that sequence. No, the trees hadn't fallen. The reason I say this is because I understand fallen to be blah, blah, blah. That's my assumption. And so if I say I understand it, that's one way, but it'd be better to say, in stating this, I have assumed, so that they can see that it is actually the assumption. And I base this opinion on, so they can see that those are the facts that you're using.
It's hard to think about that stuff when it's so self-evident that a 3-year-old child should be able to work it out, though.
It is. So I can tell you, in this particular case, it was an interesting one. A contractor was asked to do some tree work, and he was being paid by the hour. And he got to about 2 weeks, and he still hadn't been paid. 2 weeks of work, 80 hours of work. And so he said, we're not going to do any more. The property owner then sued him and said, you haven't finished all the work, and I need all this done. It's going to cost me $30,000 to get it finished. So we want to take money off what you say we owe you. In fact, you owe us money. And one of my comments was, if he's being paid by the hour, then any additional work is not something that you can sue for. It's already stuff that hasn't been done. You know, by the hour, it doesn't make sense that you can then ask for it to be finished or completed. The only way you can complete on by the hour is to continue until the work. And I thought that was incredibly self-evident, Peter. But it was so self-evident that at least one solicitor and a judge couldn't figure it out. And that's why I'm saying you really do, when you get to legal work, to spell it out as clearly as you can. Happy with that? And what is an expert? Does anyone know by legal definition?
It's
I mean,
somebody
the
that
definition
has better than
my
average.
definition was always elongated drip.
A little bit like that, yeah. So, Peter, you were saying?
Somebody that has better than average knowledge of the subject.
Experience or knowledge. So your experience is valid. Don't discount your experience, but remember to account for that experience. In other words, I have seen more than 1,000 trees that have fallen over, and I've never seen a tree sit back up and reconsolidate itself around the root system. That's a valid position. I've seen more failed trees than the average person. It then means that any other expert can also question that. So the way, Andrew, the way I would deal with that as an expert on the other side, assuming that you had it, I would say, well, actually, that's interesting, Mark. So whilst Mr. Hartley states that this has never happened, this is actually a tree. This is it. The day that it fell over, this is it 3 weeks later, and you can see it's beautifully consolidated around. That would be good evidence to disprove. And this is a process we call falsification. And if you read the Laman Street report that I wrote, that concept is discussed in there, being able to falsify evidence. That is there some way? Falsify doesn't mean use false evidence. Falsifying evidence means, is there some way you can show that the facts are right or wrong? Okay. And so if somebody says that trees have fallen over with their root plates tilted out of the ground, and you can show a photograph that says they hadn't, then the whole material that goes with that concept should be just dismissed.
Yep.
Okay. And that's what an expert is looking to do. And that's what, although the law firm is looking to do, the solicitor or the barrister will be trying to make you look like you're not an expert. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, Mark, do you remember that case over a fire up at Mount Victoria that you and I had a look at?
Yeah, yep.
That was a good example. In the beginning, they'd made the assumption that the arborist should have detected a cavity in the branch that they believed failed, caused the branch to fall on the wires and start the fire. But we discovered that, from memory, the tree next to it had actually had a cupboard door failure. It rotated, fell against this other tree. The cavity still existed, and that tree had a whiplash effect, which caused the failure.
Yeah.
And the arborist at the time didn't. Their claim for a cause was not, in fact, what caused the failure of that branch. It was the other tree falling against it.
Yeah, and that again couldn't have been reasonably foreseen. But there were some other things in that. Just because something is foreseeable or can be seen doesn't necessarily mean that it will be. So, and that one of the things that I know was discussed was, here's a tree with a very small a cavity opening, maybe the size of your fist, 20 meters off the track through bush. Yep. Were you likely to see it? Was it obscured by brush? Was there foliage? And if you had gone, would you have gone up and tapped on it? And one of the young arborists involved in it, not young, he's a year younger than me, the bastard, went out and jumped up onto the fallen log that was from that adjacent tree and went up and tapped and said, that's what I do. And I said, well, that's neat, Scott, but I can't even stand up on that other log. I can't get there. So again, your assumptions you're making is that everyone is physically as adroit as you. And again, that's the thing that you need to say. A person as physically inactive as me would find that difficult. And yes, it is true that if I had a 3-meter step ladder with me, I would have been able to go up and examine it. But taking a 3-meter step ladder is not a standard part of my consulting equipment when I'm walking along.
Right.
So again, it's just this detail for legal stuff that is different than the detail for that might be required for a development site report or for a domestic report for a client. Remembering the primary function of a report is to do what?
Just on that previous thing you were talking about, Mark, I have difficulty with the concept that just because you can identify a feature in a tree, then that means that the subsequent failure was foreseeable. I mean, how many trees could you find with a cavity that didn't fail? And so why does the fact that you have this one tree that had a cavity and then failed mean that had you seen the cavity, then you would have known that it would fail? I find that just completely...
Yeah, look, that's a good question. And Peter, a lot of it does in this case, and I've been critical of this dozens of times, and I'm happy to be publicly. Lots of big organizations have really poor policies that are appallingly written. By big organizations, utility companies, roads, government departments, councils.
National parks.
It's not a nasty one. Very quickly, before David disappears, I think he might have ducked out. But David, yes, all 14 trees were removed. After spending $1.98 million fighting the local community, the city then spent $1.8 million removing the 14 trees, putting in tree vaults and replanting. So that's basically, as I understand the figures. So fair amount of money unnecessarily spent, at least from a risk perspective, but probably well spent from other perspectives. And I looked at the trees about 12 months ago, and they're going along fairly well. In fact, they're doing really well. They're growing quite rapidly. And that's one of the advantages of them being in, these high soil vaults. But it is Ficus microcarpellii, so it's fairly quick growing. So get back to policies. The Electrical Authority has a policy that any defective tree needs to be assessed. And then they give a list of everything they think is defective. So any tree with a hollow, any tree with a cavity. Now, what percentage of large eucalypts have a hollow?
Pretty much all of them.
And so
all of them,
yeah, this is where we start creating witch hunts. A city that says we'll manage our trees so that they're safe. That city needs to be taken out and flogged. Okay, because by safe, some people will understand zero risk. And it's just how things are worded and communicated makes a huge difference. So my recommendation back to the Electrical Authority in my report for that one and the one before, Derek, was they really need to look at tightening up how they communicate. They need to improve the quality of their training for their staff. And that came out of the Victorian cases. So Victoria, there was a small little case in Victoria, group action with multiple beneficiaries that settled at $500 million. That's $500 million. The Electrical Authority didn't have the money, so the government picked it all up in the end, and local people in Melbourne pay for that. And who's Melbourne here? Yeah. Guys, I feel sorry for you because you guys are getting screwed over like nothing at the moment. Your financial position is back to where it was going back 30 years ago, all over again. And so, yes, anyhow, there was a $500 million settlement. And, with those typical class actions, a whole pile of law firms had solicitors and barristers buying Ferraris and Lamborghinis, obviously, or the equivalent. In other words, there was large settlements. They get a large portion. So something on that, they may have got something like $100 million out of the 500. I don't know exactly what it is, not my business, but they would have got a large chunk of it. It might only been, $50 million, still a large settlement for running a court case. And as a result, they started going after every fire case they could. The court and the coroner in Victoria said, look, people that are doing these assessments need to be adequately qualified. They need to be able to at least perform a ground-based tree defect evaluation, and the assessed trees, whatever, assessed and analysed trees, or whatever it is now, is the current one, had to have at least those 2 units. Prior to that, it was acceptable for a person that was doing this assessment to have been a labourer on a crew that had hurt himself, and now he couldn't do what he was doing, so he'd do this routine inspection. And often the training courses were just 2 or 3 days long. And what was an anomaly there was that the people that inspect telegraph poles are far better, or were far better trained than arborists going back 10 years ago. So the average arborist doing those inspections of those trees would have got 3 days training and some experience. Person doing a pole inspection went to pole school for 2 weeks and then took 3 months of being watched by an overseer before he could even go out and look at poles by himself. And so, again, this is a policy-based thing. Surely if we're going to take responsibility from trees failing, we need to have a policy that's well thought out and intelligent. And I would encourage any person working for a government department to make sure somewhere in their policy relating to trees, they state unequivocally, we do not intend to manage trees so that they're absolutely safe. We manage our trees so that there is some residual level of risk that is less than the benefits provided by the tree. Put that in writing, and now it's harder to argue.
Yeah, in our case, we've worded it so that we endeavour to reduce the level of risk to an acceptable level. That's how we put it.
To an acceptable level, and to an acceptable level is fine. But of course, if you say we intend to reduce, or we seek to reduce the level of risk, then there's always a lower level of risk. And so again, it's this. So I would say, Derek, go back and tighten that more. Make sure that it's clear that it's not, oh, yes, the risk was low, but we can make it low. One of the things that the basic tree risk assessment from the ISA has is you go through, you do all the assessment, it comes out low, and then you write down the remedial actions required to reduce that risk. Well, that never makes sense. And when you reevaluate what's the residual risk, it's low. That doesn't make intuitive sense in terms of it's not about risk management at that point in time. And so you need to be clear that there's a point to which the benefits provided by trees just far outweigh it. If you haven't seen the one-page David Evans one, let me open it for you. What's David's organisation, Peter?
Valid.
Thanks. He has a one-pager. I've thought about getting them printed up as A2 or A1 posters to put up all over the place, because I just think it makes the situation so much clearer. And this is this obvious tree risk features, or obvious, tree risk features. And up the top here, there's a lovely little one. I'll just zoom in so you can see it, because it gives you good context. Compared to everyday risk we readily accept, a risk of being killed or injured by trees or branches falling is extremely low. The risk over a year is less than a 400-kilometre, 250 mile drive. That you think about it, over an entire year, the risk from trees to you is about the same as driving 400 kilometres. Who here is likely to do more than 400 kilometers this year? This week? Yeah. You know, driving for me is a lot higher risk than trees. So yes, it's a great little one page that talks about the things that are the primary cause for concern for us. Mind you, I don't know that cutting those chunks out of the trunks necessarily bad for some trees either. There are trees that'll tolerate that till the cows come home. If you've ever seen it done to a camphor laurel, they laugh back at you and say, my car can do more than that. One of my favorite samples in the collection we have here is a camphor laurel that somebody poisoned, going to kill it off, and it died back really hard and then continued to grow and completely occlude the poisoning holes. So, yeah, amazing trees. So, yeah, I would encourage you to do at least download it for free document. David's got a whole pile of policy stuff. I think in terms of risk, he's done a real great job of trying to make risk management a better process by coming up with appropriate documents. So if you haven't seen them, you know, stuff for the homeowner, strategy, landowners, schools, you know, government, what should it do? If you haven't gone through and read and looked at his strategies, I'll encourage you to do so. And they're there for you to use. They're made public domain for a reason. So take the concepts, take the ideas, take the exact wording. They are all open source information. Okay, guys, that covers it for tonight. Is there something you want to have covered next war?
So if anybody does have any ideas, please feel free to let me know, and we'll organise it.
I will promise you by next time around, I'll have the photographs for Laman Street for you, so you can have a look at 2 or 3 of those trees and 2 or 3 of the images in some of the other reports, so you can see how, again, this process of miscommunicating and not stating. So what really the first report should have been was XYZ at the council has informed me that the trees, and then that would have probably avoided the whole thing. It was just a stupid mistake. And by the time it had got to the end of the Chinese whispers, I see the conspiracy theory, which was completely wrong. There's no conspiracy. It was just stupidity. And by stupidity, I don't mean that disrespectfully. I mean making mistakes. That's things that we all do. And so I then added to those mistakes by making my own mistakes and inflaming the situation rather than trying to mediate a good solution. So guys, thanks for that.
Thanks, Mark.